good. Okay, great.
Thank you for joining, everybody. My name is Mark Sendak. I'm one of the co-leads of Health AI Partnership. This is our Real World AI in Healthcare series, jointly held with Kaiser Permanente. Today, we are very excited to host a session featuring Nicholas Jacobson and Roy Perlis. I'll read a sentence about each, but the part of why we're excited is there's so much in the public narrative right now around how AI and generative AI language models can be used in mental health and behavioral health. And this is one of the first, if not the first, I think, Nicholas, RCTs of a natural language system used for therapy. So we're excited to have two esteemed panelists. So Nicholas Jacobson is Associate Professor in Biomedical Data Science, Psychiatry, and Computer Science at Dartmouth College, and he's a director of the AI and Mental Health Innovation and Technology Guided Healthcare Laboratory. And Dr. Roy Perlis is professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and director of the Center for Quantitative Health at MGH, where he holds a Ronald, I won't even try to say that last name, Roy, an endowed chair. And he is the associate chief for research in psychiatry and editor in chief of JAMA AI. So I'll hand it over. We're looking forward to the presentation of research, the discussion, and then time for audience Q&A. Nicholas, are you so over?
I'm here, should be able to share slides if that works. Does this?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, looking forward to talking with you all. I'm going to be talking about our work with a system we call Therabot. We started this journey about over 6 years now, and working on using generative AI to derive evidence-based treatment. And I'll talk to you a little bit about kind of background, but then also a lot of this is going to be about the development journey and a lot of things that didn't go well before we started having some success. So I always like to have some slides on background. Folks here may have some experience with this, but nonetheless, I think it's good to make sure we're all on the same page. Mental health disorders are really exceedingly prevalent. Common mental health disorders occur in about 1 in 3 people in any given year. Mental health disorders are the leading cause of global disease burden and leading cause of disability worldwide. Unfortunately, our care system really doesn't sufficiently scale to provide enough treatment to folks that actually need it. So most folks that would have a mental health disorder don't receive minimally adequate care. And that's a pretty low bar. That's a single session in a given year with any type of mental health provider. And annually, depending on how you do the math and where folks are, the range between the number of patients per provider with just common mental health disorders is between 1,300 to 1,800 in any given year. So that would be the number of patients if we were going to actually be at a system level where capacity wise we could actually treat everybody who had an incidence of a disorder. We'd have to have really multiple orders of magnitude more than what we have, really, because in large part, a full caseload for a psychotherapist is about 20, 26, 27 patients in a given week. So we're pretty far off from where we need to be to actually provide care. One of the ways that folks have really thought about providing care at scale is something called digital therapeutics. And so you'll call these have gone by many different names, but essentially different digital intervention components that can be scaled through the internet. And they are wonderful in how accessible they are. So folks can come in and begin an intervention with one of these things really very, very easily. One of the things that you'll see when you look at these types of data, though, is engagement is a hugely problematic. So folks that would install an application, most of them will be gone within the first 3 days. Um, and so this is sometimes called this prototypical hockey stick pattern. You see this in really virtually all types of applications in this space, which is a real challenge. I mean, it's like most folks that would begin aren't often like really sticking with it in probably a way that could actually promote behavior change. I think a lot of this is really based on essentially things that were really developed for in-person interventions that were converted into like long-form self-help material through the internet. And this type of thing is not a super engaging medium. Like reading about things in long form, a lot of folks will drop off. One of the ways that some folks have tried to improve this engagement problem in a digital form is through chatbots. And I'll talk a little bit about things that are not generative chatbots to start with, because this is what most people have been doing. In fact, if you have heard of an AI chatbot, largely within for most of the literature, when they call it an AI chatbot, what they actually generally mean is that they're doing these types of structured or authored chatbots with some routing logic or intent matching that often is part of the system. That's where most of the system has been for most people, and in the mental health space, at least in the past 15 years. And it's been really kind of increasingly popular in the last 15 years to develop these types of things. So essentially, they're taking this content that could be delivered in another digital intervention form, could be a website, could be another medium. And the idea is that they're breaking these down into like chunks and paired with a bunch of if-then statements. So essentially a lot of routing logic around this. And when you're designing the system, you're really trying to come up with essentially everything that the chatbot will say up front. And that's why I would call it an authored or structured chatbot, in ways that the worst thing that can happen with these types of things is you don't actually predict the intent of what someone will say. But they can't go off the rails like some other mediums in the same way, because you've already essentially set what the chatbot is going to say in advance. You've undoubtedly all experienced with conversational agents, or if not authored chatbots, so whether in chat form or through a voice. Before, customer service has loved these things for the last 15 years, and I think you actually know a lot of what the experience is like for the end user with these types of things in that type of experience. You kind of can often get some of the content to where you need to be, but often the experience is actually a little bit frustrating along the way. And I think that's part of that is because language is inherently fairly fluid, and you can't really easily anticipate every direction that it's going to go. So when you're trying to imagine, when you're the system designer, exactly what this chatbot is going to say all up front, it really makes it hard to actually deliver on that in a way that is actually conversational. Generally, I think though they're delivered in a conversational medium, like they're in the format of what would be like a traditional conversation, they actually aren't very conversational in nature. I knock this. We've done work in this area. So I'm like knocking kind of some of the capabilities of the type of prior work that we've done here as well. I think the nice thing about it is it scales, and there are some decently easy ways that you can scale interventions. The effect sizes are modest, I guess, in terms of how big of changes that you might be able to have. But I think that the nice side is, although the upside might not be particularly high, the downside is also relatively low. You're not going to have huge risks often associated with this type of medium. So there's a few different things I think that are missing from prior digital intervention work. So I mentioned the engagement. I think another piece that is really found a lot in the bedrock of human providers and therapy, what like the strongest evidence we have for how psychotherapy works is through, at least as a formation, a reliance on the ability to have work together and form a bond with your provider and work together on a common goal. So this patient-therapist bond called the therapeutic alliance, being able to get together, trust one another, and work together on this common goal is essentially how therapy is thought to work. It's one of the key mechanisms explaining the largest portion of variance and most psychotherapy research. And a lot of this like type of relationship, I think, is really hard to mimic entirely through traditional digital therapeutics. There is actually literature that folks do form bonds with these kind of things, and that are even more clunky. So some of the tool-based work, much like you might actually develop some emotional attachment to a hammer or something, and your favorite tool that you might have, you can develop a bond. But I think the bond is probably not optimal through those other mediums in terms of how you might be able to actually develop rapport and trust and a formation that would be delivered in a relational form. I think another thing that about traditional digital intervention formats is they're really often designed for kind of one type of clinical problem at a time. And probably the most complex they can get in addressing co-occurrences is so co-occurring problems or comorbidity is that they will be modular in nature, meaning you might have one module of, let's say, somebody had social anxiety disorder and alcohol use disorder. You might have a module for social anxiety and a module for alcohol use, and you have one and then another, but they're essentially treated as separate issues. This is a really big drawback because most folks that are really experiencing mental health problems or experiencing different problems within their life are really experiencing not just one, but multiple at the same time. And unlike how most digital intervention work has treated them, they're not just something that happens one and then the other, and then they're isolated problems. Somebody who has like social anxiety and an alcohol abuse disorder is often like probably drinking in social settings. And that is functionally interconnected and linked. So the idea of like trying to treat them as separable issues that you wouldn't actually address together, I think is a little bit of an inability to actually meet the context where it is. Humans, I think, in their care would absolutely think about these things as an interconnected pattern and try to address them in ways that aren't distinct. But a lot of our digital interventions, because of all of the types of combinations, it's impractical to kind of really think about all of those types of things through the traditional way of deciding or sorry, really coming up with digital intervention content, designing, that was the word I was looking for, could not find. In terms of one of the things that I think is promising about this is really, we could really potentially mimic a lot of the things that we could actually address and really human therapy and trying to actually do this more fluidly through generative AI. So generative AI are really based in particular that I'll be talking about is within large language models, can really deliver things that are personalized and adaptive responses that are really fairly heavily tailored to the user input. So change quite a bit based on what people are saying, and may have potential for higher engagement due to this dynamic interacting capability. So really able to address things. So I will also talk a little bit about this, and I think folks my guess is have some interest in discussing this because a lot of folks are actually already using generative AI for some types of, try to act like a therapist. These general purpose generative AI products, these foundation models, are really not designed or tested for clinical treatment. And they often don't really practice what evidence-based techniques would actually look like, even when you ask them to do so. So I do think what I'm going to talk about is something that a system that we are trying to design specifically to deliver evidence-based care, and the care that you would receive if you just prompt in one of these foundation models generally is really inadequate, and very often will provide harmful responses that I think really, because of that, we've been approaching this with trying to come at it from the ground up and build something that could be actually used in that way for clinical use. So we set out to develop a generative chatbot that can respond dynamically to a giving user response with a therapeutic response. Chatbots work essentially by building on examples. You feed in a lot of examples of data, and they try to learn and emulate from that. They are trying to predict the next word, a token at a time, or a word at a time, essentially. And in giving them example data, a lot of what we're feeding in for what is great example data from these types of things is actually conversational media. So we're wanting these things to actually emulate conversations that would happen back and forth. It's like the type of data that we want to feed into these things. The first, so getting into this area, I was really excited about the developments that had happened. And this was in early 2019. So this is like 3 years before ChatGPT had launched. I was coming in and seeing kind of where the models were at that point, and I was already actually really excited about the potential here in terms of they were producing some level of fluidity. I think that was exciting to me in terms of the direction that they were going, and I thought they would already be in a spot where they could be of clinical use. And I had some naive thoughts coming into this, thinking, oh, this would we just needed a lot of data to start with. Like these models are extremely data hungry, was a lot of how I thought about this, and that we needed just sheer large amounts of data. And so I started within the context of trying to go to self-help forums where you'd start with essentially exchanges on the internet between different folks that are often experiencing the same problem, trying to get together and talk to one another around that. And there's actually a decent amount of academic literature around these types of topics. They generally kind of have better outcomes when you're exposed to these types of these mental health forums. So I thought this would be a good place to start. So we train one of these large language models on it. And in our first interaction with it, we say, I'm feeling depressed. Sometimes I don't want to get out of bed. And the therapeutic response is life is such a struggle. Most days I don't know how I have the energy to go on. I end up wanting to cry alone in a corner. I just want my life to be over. Really not what we were going for. So like really pretty much a pretty big failure. So we abandoned ship on that approach and really went to what we thought would be the next stage of things. And I think a lot of folks are actually in the field really excited about this, but this potential for actually building this based on actual psychotherapists. And so we had this large corpus of psychotherapy training video transcripts. So these are not only like really thinking about things being the expert, but exemplars of things that like psychotherapists would people would want to learn from. Essentially, they're putting forth as good practice. And so we started training on thousands of these. And then we interacted with these models. So you'd say, I'm feeling depressed. Sometimes I don't want to get out of bed. And then the model would say, what do you think I should do? Go on. I don't know what else to say. I want some help. And your problems stem from your relationship with your mother. This happened usually within the first 3 to 5 conversation turns. And usually the mother would not have been discussed at all. So I think also really not very useful in terms of like the direction. So one of the things that we saw in these first 2 approaches, though, was that the model responses couldn't have been more different from one another. So the model that was trained on the peer-to-peer interactions and these forum data really couldn't have been more different from the psychotherapy training video transcripts. And in doing that, I think it really showed us that we just had the wrong data and we needed to actually form the data. So from then, we started developing the data ourselves. So rather than trying to take something that was easy, something that was large, and just trying to extrapolate that off, we started to build the data that we wanted ourselves. So we were essentially write handwritten vignettes of what evidence-based treatment would look like within the system that we want to build. And as we're going, essentially having systematic ways that folks are designing this around evidence-based treatment, and that would be around a chat-based medium. And that's when things started to kind of go decently well for us. So over time, we started getting about, and our models that were trained on the psychotherapy training video transcripts. We did a ton of evaluation of these models over time. And about 1 in 10 of the ones that was trained on the psychotherapy training video transcripts, about 1 in 10 of those responses was both personalized and like adaptive and evidence-based. So like not very good. As we started to like build the data ourselves, so folks on the team handwriting our content, we really started to have a much greater level of success. The responses started to actually get much better. So this got into the point where about 9 in 10 of our responses were really evidence-based, kind of something that we'd be happy with, frankly, in terms of the how well they were operating. And this was 6 months before ChatGPT was launched, so a long time ago, actually. And at least in this space, because it's a fast-moving space. And I think at that point, the next 2 years we focused on nearly entirely on safety, and really trying to actually test how well these models performed in kind of unseen territory. So where you're trying to actually amplify and worsen psychopathology, try to worsen suicide, and really try to get them in ways to support these things. And so we spent a lot of effort in doing and testing these models in an effort that it's called purple teaming. It's if you have folks that are there are similar terms that have emerged in other areas. When you've been testing system designs around red teaming, which is essentially some of the same efforts where you're trying to break the model or misuse it. And purple teaming is a similar concept, but instead of just trying to test that from an independent team, it's the same team that is coming at this, that is both trying to break it and then also patch and protect against it. Those types of exploits that you might be seeing in terms of how it acts. And so we essentially would systematically then test that, the members of the team, and then see how it would behave until we didn't find any further holes. I don't know what happened there, but okay. All right, so this system we call Therabot. We've then designed this with folks on the team. This is the UI of it. It's a chat-based medium. You would type in, we've got a little avatar that is animated and will change based on what you say in terms of its affective responses and things like that. And yeah, it'll go back and forth and generate responses. We have tested Therabot in a randomized controlled trial that took place over the last summer, and published that this year in the New England Journal of Medicine AI. And I'll be talking a little bit next about the trial. We have a little bit of an unusual trial design, at least unusual in the sense that most digital intervention trials are often single types of populations. When you try to study them, just depression or anxiety or that kind of thing. We wanted to start with kind of really common mental health disorders and a range of them all at once, in large part because Therabot has actually been trained on all common occurrence and some rare occurrences of things that happen in mental health because of the range of comorbidities that folks may experience. So we really tried to recruit folks with clinical levels of depression, generalized anxiety disorder, clinically high risk for feeding and eating disorders. And from there, we essentially did an RCT where we assigned them to either the interventions of the Therabot condition or a waitlist control. And then we looked at outcomes for the degree of change that folks had between coming in and 4 weeks later and 8 weeks later. And then secondarily, we were really interested in their engagement, acceptability, and therapeutic compliance. These are the primary outcomes that we saw in terms of the degree of change that happened in the intervention group or those that were given Therabot and the waitlist control group. And so you'll see that on average, there's a lot going on this slide, but essentially you're going to see distributions of change that happen. And so the the distributions of change, you'll see that the intervention group is in blue and the control group is in red. Each one of these is an outcome. So each one of these is the degree of change that happened and the outcomes and depression and generalized anxiety and then essentially eating disorder symptoms. And you'll see the blue group is always to the left. They folks in the Therabot group experienced more change than the control group did, and all of them were significant. I think of note though, like the effect sizes on the degree to which they experience differential change is really pretty large relative to what you would see. So like all of these effect sizes are between essentially 0.6 and around 0.85, 0.9. And doing that, that's pretty comparable to kind of what essentially some of the best evidence-based interventions might look like. So really promising, and we need to test this in a head-to-head trial. Frankly, that's one of the things I'm excited to do. This is a wait list control, but in a lot of ways, I think really exciting directions in the magnitude. One of the things that was also really interesting within the trial was we measured the alliance between folks and Therabot, like how much they essentially developed this working alliance with Therabot. And we use the same measure that's been developed between humans and human providers. So like actually this outpatient kind of experience between folks and their providers. And the norms that we, or the data that we got from folks rating this really strongly mirror the same type of outpatient numbers you'd get. So the norms are really, really very similar. So really mirroring essentially very similar levels of therapeutic alliance that you see in the literature between patients and their human providers in outpatient settings. Folks had high user satisfaction with it, liked it, found it intuitive, et cetera. Overall, most folks ended up thinking it was really like a real help therapist and overall satisfied with it. So that was all good on the feasibility, acceptability front. Engagement over time is another thing that we were looking at. And this is pretty different from the numbers that I was showing earlier. I'm going to walk you through this plot too, because there's a lot going on. And the x-axis or left to right, it's the number of days in the study. Each little block here is a day. So if it's colored and it's more towards like the green to yellow, it means that they interacted, sent more messages to Therabot on that day. When it's white, it means they didn't send any messages to Therabot on that day. And each row is a participant ID. So you'll see there's a lot of color in this graph, a lot of folks that interacted with it and interacted with the system quite a lot. So sending, on average, hundreds of messages to Therabot over the course of the trial, interacting with Therabot on over 6 hours on average. So really, if we're going to convert these numbers into what actually like a dose of therapy might be, it's something around the lines of around 8 sessions worth of in-person therapy if we're going to try to compare the two. So in this process, I think there are kind of several things that I want to kind of emphasize, and that data quality is probably the single most important lesson for what we learned, is that really the things that we saw was the things that were easy were often sacrificing this data quality, and the things that were like these, what seemed to be low-hanging fruit, really ended up producing really quite weak kind of outcomes. And because of that, we really needed the strong expert curated content. At this point, just to give you a magnitude of this, on the time spent, we've had over 100 people on the research team spend over 100,000 human hours designing the system. So really spent a long time at this with a lot of folks that are really part of that process. I think generally we found that this is capable of serving as a standalone intervention and can really potentially demonstrate large, significant reductions in depression, anxiety, and eating disorder symptoms across time. Engagement was really outstanding. And I think generally it's a promising tool for mental health treatment, with data quality and user engagement being really pivotal to success. I want to thank my collaborators for all the work that they do, and then really more than anyone, thank the lab that is enables all of this work to take place. I'm really happy to jump in and talk through things in the future, but now I'll shift over, I think, to Roy next.
Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Jacobson. I'll then hand over to Roy if you want to share reflections, ask any initial questions.
Thanks, Nick, for a really lovely presentation and frankly, a very nice paper, I should say at the outset. I have enormous respect for both building the tool, but most importantly, getting it into trials. Um, one of the first times I presented using like applying NLP to electronic health records was at the Broad Institute. And I'll never forget one of the senior scientists there stood up and said at the end of my talk, is this a problem of science or engineering? And it was sort of dripping with scorn, but the implication was that the engineering was somehow lesser than the science. And I think they're both really important, but I want to recognize the engineering required to develop a clinical intervention and study it at this scale is takes took a lot of vision. So I think for the group, it's really, I think, important to underscore that it's not easy to do clinical trials. It's not easy to do trials in mental health in particular, where IRBs very often don't understand a lot of things about mental health. Patients are either so dangerous that one can't possibly expose them to experimental interventions, or what they have is so benign that one can't possibly justify any sort of intervention because, really they should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And I'm sorry to say that, but my experience over 20 plus years of doing clinical trials in mental health is that IRBs tend to not be fully savvy about the kinds of populations that we're studying. So first of all, congratulations on doing the study. Just to put it in context, it's 60 years, almost exactly, since Joe Wiesenbaum published ELIZA, arguably the first chatbot. And even as clunky as ELIZA might seem by modern standards, the story is told that people using ELIZA asked for privacy and shooed the investigators out of the room and said, "Excuse me, I'm having a private conversation." So we're wired to attach to things if given the opportunity. And I really like what you said about alliance and this sort of difference that people can detect between a series of if-then statements and something that's actually responding with natural language and, isn't just a decision tree. As long as we're talking about history, it was around 30 years ago that Lee Baer and John Greist and others described something called BT steps, which was an automated form of cognitive behavioral therapy for OCD that used the then emerging technology of IVR, right? So if you're experiencing this, press 1. If you're experiencing this, press 2. Um, and in a lot of ways, it was way more advanced for its time in actually applying cognitive behavioral therapy for OCD in an automated way. But it never really caught on because of the alliance piece, because the attrition rates were so high. The other challenge, the other reason it never caught on was no one could figure out quite how to incorporate it in treatment. So, you're stepping into a space, you chose to step into a space that people have been struggling with for many decades. And by the way, even when ELIZA was sort of making fun of Rogerian therapists, but it did not escape their attention that it could be used for clinical purposes. So, even then people had this idea that we might get here. it's exciting to see you, sort of getting here. And I think I guess I'd call out a few things that won't be a surprise to you, but I think are important for the group to understand. The first is you mentioned at the beginning the problem of access. And we should stipulate that I would always rather have a person as my therapist than a computer. But for the vast majority of our patients, that's impossible. Insurance companies, even the commercial ones, even the good ones, have these ghost networks where it's just about impossible to find a therapist. And most therapists who can, many therapists opt out of taking insurance. And so I wish I lived in a world where we could all have a very well-trained therapist, particularly one well-trained in evidence-based therapies, but we don't. And so I think the way you positioned your intervention as sort of an add-on to other forms of treatment is really important. I guess I would also note that while it is true that most people would prefer a human therapist, not everyone would. And there is also emerging evidence that for some people, they'd way rather talk to their phone or text with Claude, frankly, than go see a therapist. So you're addressing in some ways both kinds of needs. But I have to underscore the access problem. Like this is something that this kind of approach is something we desperately need in psychiatry, unless and until we're prepared to invest more, and that ain't gonna happen anytime soon. In terms of things that I would note, are things where in the next iteration you'll certainly do it differently. Obviously, waitlist control, right? So the field in general is moving away from waitlist control because we recognize if we have better things to offer people, at least in terms of attention. And in your study, people do get these regular reminders. They potentially get human outreach if the app has gone wrong, or given a response that doesn't seem right. I think that was a really important safety consideration. And I want to again underscore that safety was to me one of the most impressive things about this study beyond the effectiveness was that you could do it safely. You could deliver this intervention safely. That said, probably the next round, it sounds like you're going to use a more active control, whether it's another app or something else. And, those will be exciting studies to see. I guess my main questions for you would be, oh, by the way, I mean, I guess, obviously you can't do a blinded study. Some of the critiques were, well, it wasn't blinded. Well, of course it wasn't blinded. I do think there are large expectancy effects in psychiatry trials. And so, yes, the alliance ratings are probably inflated. I think, some of the effect there, people are happy that they got the active intervention. It's really hard to do. I mean, it's really hard to get around that. The only other thing that I might quibble with is the sort of nationally representative sample. You're recruiting people over the internet who presumably are more able to use the internet, more interested in doing things on the internet, more willing to disclose things. I don't think that in any way invalidates the study. And in fact, I think that's probably the right initial population, but I'm sure you guys will go on and do more clinical populations. With those caveats, it's really lovely work, and it's nice to see this. We always say anytime psychiatry makes it into New England Journal, and by extension, New England Journal AI, I think it's a real milestone because many of those journals are traditionally somewhat biased against psychiatry. I would hope next time it'll be in a JAMA journal, but that's offline. I guess my questions for you, and maybe I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about your approach to safety.
Yeah, absolutely.
As I'm sure you see, there's a huge groundswell now building of, generative AI is dangerous and it convinces people to, makes them delusional. So how did you think about safety
Yeah, we thought about this for a long time, I guess, in terms of how we approach the system design and how we approach like the oversight within trials. So from a safety lens, I mentioned the purple teaming where we're trying to break the models and get it to actually act in ways that are unsafe. One of the things that we kind of the layers of kind of trying to build in appropriate responses. A lot of where model providers have gone within this kind of areas, they essentially, when there are crisis situations that emerge, they withhold care. They kind of shut the conversation down, refer out. Um, that was something within the team we thought a lot about and decided to go kind of the opposite direction. In large part, that we want to have folks continue to be able to interact with something that they are actually potentially using in a therapeutic way. So instead of shutting conversations down and referring out alone, we still allow them to interact, and we've trained the models to actually try to provide crisis care. Um, it's not what we hope that they actually use for crisis care, to be frank, but we don't just refer out. We have essentially within the UI a crisis button that starts to flash. When they click that, that would take them to 911, the National Suicide Hotline, and the crisis text line. That would be essentially a click away. That then they click to it would have the phone inserted within the dialer, or have the text message kind of inserted that way. So those are built on essentially a bunch of crisis classifiers that we have built alongside this as well to try to detect these types of crises. Um, so that's a little bit of like how we have tried to handle that within the product line. In no setting have we or we would ever think about these things being delivered absent some type of oversight. So in all future iterations of this, we want a human to be involved. Um, Within the trial, we monitored every message that was sent to her from the bot in near real time. I didn't get a whole lot of sleep in the first half of this trial because, frankly, I was really reading every message myself in the first bit. Um, in large part because these models are new and it's a very new area, and I really don't want to harm folks. So we essentially had protocols to then intervene should anything come up. I think the areas that we did have to intervene within the course of the trial was in retrospect, it's so silly we didn't think of this, but so many folks overgeneralized kind of our intent of what we were providing towards like interpreting this as broad domain medical use. So there's a number of folks that actually talked with Therabot about their STD symptoms and like really asked for advice around that. And Therabot responded in ways that like seem reasonable enough actually in trying to diagnose and treat that, but it is not what we were intending, and it's beyond its area of competency for sure. So in that way, whenever we had to intervene within those cases and actually reach out and suggest that they actually go and see a physician about those kinds of symptoms, in large part because it's outside of the domain. Um, the other ways we also reached out, and in the case of folks expressing, there were folks that did experience suicidal intent during the course of the trial. We did reach out to those folks, and then had humans in the loop to try to de-escalate those types of situations as well. So yeah, that's a little bit of how we think of safety. I think in terms of the scale, like our model classifiers performed exceptionally well. And my hope is that the next time we do this, we start to rely, as we get evidence for the safety, we scale the level of oversight to increasingly rely on kind of computational methods to try to predict the level of risk, predict the level of oversight that we would have in terms of these things so that they can actually scale, because that type of mechanism doesn't solve our problem. Actually, if you think about this in a new setting, like if we were going to do that in every deployment, why not just have the humans deliver the therapy? In some ways, that's a lot of how we think about safety and oversight, is trying to design something that really wouldn't end up harming folks in ways that we couldn't actually do something about.
So Nick, just for the group, the traditional way to handle suicidality in at least primary care medicine and psychiatry has been not to ask about it.
Sure.
So the very existence of the PHQ-8 reflects the notion that if we don't ask people about suicidality. There's no medical legal
Yeah.
burden imposed, and so let's just not ask about it.
Yeah.
And I do think the fact that you weren't, and there have been papers published criticizing other chatbots or other approaches for not immediately terminating the conversation
Sure.
when suicidality is expressed. And to me, your approach is much more rational. This person is in crisis. We should offer options, but probably not hang up on them.
Yeah.
With a number of these sort of foundation or frontier models will basically end the conversation. Um, so could you say more about your crisis detection and how, for this group that's interested in AI and building models, what's broadly speaking, how do you decide based on the input who's in crisis?
Yeah. So essentially, our system tries to identify a large number of different types of clinical areas that we're trying to predict. So we try to differentiate different classes of types of things. So we try to detect things that are very obvious, acute signs of things that are very unambiguous, near-term intent expressed related to suicide. We have near-term intent related to things like uh, aggression and homicide that are related to these types of things. So, and those are the things that we would need to act on very much immediately, unambiguously. So that's one class. The things that are absolutely imminent. There's a large number of other types of areas that we're trying to also detect. There's a lot of ideation. So suicide is very common in mental health populations. We have different classifiers for just something that is a kind of passive thoughts of death. I mean, a lot of folks within different clinical populations will experience these types of things. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually imminently thinking about ending their life. It can be something that they think about what it would be like if they weren't around. So we have classifiers related to those types of kind of more passive ideation, things like this. We have classifiers that are related to folks that are engaging in specific disordered eating content and things that are life threatening. So like really trying to like absolutely intake no calories or things like this, or such a low calories that would actually be of a great concern, and they would need to be go into a spot where they would actually. So like we've got a broad range of things, and then we have also kind of classifiers that are ambiguous. So we are trying to actually detect things that are ambiguous enough statements that could be leaning into different clinical direction domains. So statements that, I just want this to be over. And things like this, it could mean something that is imminent about themselves. And instead of like a lot of folks that I think are in this area just kind of lump them all together, and then they try to have one classifier that predicts it all. We had a greater success in trying to actually have greater specificity, where we're trying to predict more specific isolated states, in which case our classifications become a little bit stronger. So I think in a lot of ways, I think we might be amplifying a little bit of the signal potentially within that. So these classifiers are all based on LLMs themselves, but predictive LLMs rather than, that kind of thing.
Thank you. I could easily ask you questions for the next hour, but I want to give people the chance to ask their own questions, and I'm not sure as moderator or discussant if I'm supposed to. One of the questions which I think is worth polishing off is, what's the control group here? Can you say a little more about the control?
Yeah, absolutely. So the control group is a waitlist control. Folks were not given access to any form of treatment and during the course of the trial in the control group. About 15% went on to access psychotherapy, about 15% accessed medication treatment, but vast majority did not experience at least traditional care, and we weren't providing other digital care. So we didn't like say, don't go and receive treatment or something along those lines, but definitely didn't provide anything ourselves. I think in terms of why we wanted to start start that direction. I think yeah, Roy mentioned that this is definitely not the standard of where we want to see like something that is a mature science go. Like it's definitely a relatively weak bar to do better than. The thing that we were interested in is it's a very new field, so we wanted to actually quantify the magnitude of the effects before we start to disentangle what the effects are. So in that way, we wanted to really try to start somewhere. I think the trials that we're interested in doing in the future are absolutely active controls. So both against potential comparators, so active comparators, so other types of chatbots, for example, and different types of designs. One of the things that we're really interested in is actually trying to do a trial against humans. I think we're already in a spot where one of the trials on the cusp of funding is a non-inferiority trial against human providers and seeing if we could actually be at a spot where we're not inferior, or if we are, that kind of look at the degree to which that is the case. So I'm kind of excited to do that kind of work, and hope that both we do that and the field continues to do that more broadly as it matures.
I think the VA has done perhaps the most work with PTSD in non-inferiority trials, right? So we have, individual evidence-based therapies for PTSD, but they don't scale well. So let's do a non-inferiority trial with a group. Let's do a non-inferiority trial with texting. And so I do think it sets you up to start in that direction.
Yeah.
Another of the questions has to do with how long people engaged with the chatbot and the fact that, traditional language models really tend to go off the rails when the conversation gets longer. Was that something you observed?
Yeah, we actually our text exchanges are designed in a way that we really encourage the model to be very brief in its responses. So usually the amount of content that you would see would fit within the screens and not something you're scrolling through that in the chat UI. The everything that folks said fit within context actually. So like not getting into we have memory systems in place within this, but within the course of the trial, everything fit within the context windows, and in large part because the amount of data that folks would do through like the amount of text data that they would provide through like an SMS essentially style interface is relatively short and to the point. So in that way, yeah, we didn't observe that, though folks can start new threads and things like this within the system, and so that there are possibilities for them to do that within the UI.
So speaking of possibilities, one of the questions is about, you mentioned always wanting to have a human involved. Are you thinking specifically about studying it as sort of an adjunct to a therapist or another clinician?
Potentially, I think it's a really exciting area to think about improving the efficiency and the efficacy of care. I think one of the things that's particularly challenging about that is the same dilemmas that come up with multiple human providers being in the loop actually come up in this type of setting, where if human providers often will refuse to try to, so multiple psychotherapists won't often like see a patient if there's another psychotherapist that is already seeing them, in large part because there's like different levels of emphases. If they come and approach things from different therapeutic approaches, it can be confusing to the patient, but it can kind of be overwhelming if there are too many clinical problems focused on at the same time. So it just requires a level of coordination that in some ways actually is a little bit more complex. I mean, it's less complex in terms of the safety areas because of the level of oversight of somebody that's already got an established provider. But in terms of the coordination between the responses, trying to make sure that it's always amplifying one another is, I think, one of the things that's a little bit more challenging, and that the system has to be pretty closely aligned and adherent to what the general approach would be within that provider's treatment regimen. So if they're really kind of providing evidence-based CBT, great, that's probably not a big deal. But as they step away from that, or they really have some of their own idiosyncrasies or ways that they approach treatment, that becomes more of a big deal, and kind of the ability for those things to interact, I think, is really important.
I appreciate that you called out the need to decide which symptoms to target first, or even which diagnoses to target first. I think another feature of your design that was, I think, very ambitious and made the trial more ambitious is actually this heterogeneous patient group that you allowed. Because when you read clinical trials, typically in New England Journal or JAMA, it's very homogeneous group, right? We're studying major depressive disorder with X features. But in the real world, it tends to, there's tons of comorbidity. Diagnosis may not even be clear. They may have subthreshold substance use, and it's really way more complicated. Can you say a bit more about how you're thinking about, could this tool be used in even more complicated populations where the need, unfortunately, is even greater?
Yeah. Yes, we have designed to treat it for it to treat really most mental health concerns that folks would see in a day-to-day practice in an outpatient setting. We are like thinking that this could go beyond outpatient settings, for example, in terms of like one of the areas that I think I'm actually, we put a grant in to study this and would be excited to actually study is like within inpatient settings even. So like where actually folks are often spending a lot of their time like in unstructured ways and really don't receive enough care and during high acuity areas. So I think there's the range of problems that are, I think, potentially on the map here, I think is particularly large. And as we improve it in another clinical area, it actually improves like the whole composition of things. So like, I do think there's a lot of opportunities to continue to specialize in other areas, but essentially that'll continue to take time and growth. So, but yeah, we have other trials that we're planning on other populations. So yeah.
Thank you. I think we're at the top of the hour. I will hand it back, I guess, to Mark to wrap up.
I mean, just huge thank you. I was kind of texting with colleagues here at Duke that I think it's always impressive to me how thoughtful folks are who are kind of neck deep, kind of testing these technologies in a thoughtful way in real world settings, especially as it's juxtaposed to kind of what's happening in the world today. So I'm always kind of honored to be able to host space for folks like you both and really appreciate the thoughtful dialogue. Thank you.